In the 16.1 TOTECS platform release, we've added 2 new capabilities to help speed up load times for web pages hosted in content-managed websites on the TOTECS platform. The first improvements adds the ability to profile and see how long it takes for the service to render each of the different areas on a single content-managed web page. Any number of areas can be embedded within a content-managed web page. By profiling the web page, this feature can help website administrators determine why a web page may be taking longer to load and see where there is unneeded processing on the servers for those web pages. This can then aid in utilizing the second enhancement we've added to the content managed web page areas, and that is the ability to set advanced area caching rules. These caching rules allow chosen web page areas to have their content stored after first being loaded, and then on subsequent web page requests to retrieve the area's contents from the cache. This can dramatically speed up the web page loads, since the servers need to do less work to obtain the area content and load the web page. This release adds 7 new web page area caching options that can be used in a variety of situations to best maximize web page loading times for both guest users as well as logged in users, ultimately saving time, allowing the users to shop and find the information they're looking for in a faster and efficient way. Before we start exploring how these features work, let's have an overview of how a web page is loaded on the TOTECS website. In this diagram here, we have our web browser, which we use to navigate our websites, and we have the TOTECS platform, which is hosting a content managed website within any of its projects, and this website has a domain called eg.com. The first thing that happens in a web browser, we set the address where we want to attain a web page. So that makes that request is then sent over the internet, and then TOTECS works out which website that request is relevant to. Then for that website, it begins to generate web page to return to the web browser. So here's our example web page, and each content managed web page is broken down into different web page areas. So we may have a banner area, we may have some different types of areas to display maybe a list of products, we may have a news area that displays some news items, and we may have a footer bar, and there could be also high level categories. So each content managed web page hosted on the platform can have any number of areas added to a web page. And that's a very powerful feature, but with that power comes additional complexity in order to generate these web pages, because more areas requires more effort to obtain the content and then ultimately send the final generated web page back to the web browser where it can then be loaded up. So in the backend of the TOTECS platform, there is a database that stores each of the different pieces of data that may be used to generate a content managed web page. And that data is chosen based on the user who is requesting the web page and the kind of content that they want. For each area, there may be multiple requests that need to be made to the database to obtain its data. So for example, here we have a product search result listing area that's displaying a list of products, and each of those products contains different information. We need to find the image information that tells us the primary image for this particular product. We may need to find pricing data, which is stored in separate areas of the database, and we also may need to store more information about volume discounts. So within the database, there's multiple queries that are generated for each area to contain the different pieces of data that need to be generated. There's more areas on the web page, then naturally it requires then more requests to obtain those areas, and more database requests means more time that needs to be spent in order to generate the final page. So as we can see here, if you've got many areas on a web page, in some cases it can lead to several seconds that the server needs to do its work. So the new features we've added into the platform is to enable the caching of the area content, so allow that content that was requested for that particular area to be stored within a separate part of the database or within this other caching mechanism that we have got called the user session. So if we use a caching mechanisms, we can just query the precise data that can be put into an area. So we call that cached storage. That cached data can be stored in the database in its final form, or it could be stored in the user session in its cached form as well. So then only a single request needs to be made to place that area's content into the web page. So if there is then more areas on the web page that are being cached, then less requests that need to go to the database, and then that speeds up page loads. That makes this a very powerful feature for when there is data that is common and that doesn't change that much on the web page. We can then store that data, and even if it gets a little bit out of date, that's okay, because we can then refresh the cache either every time a new session is created for a user, or over a certain limited amount of time we can replace that cached area. Now that you've got an idea of how caching works, if we log into the administration center of a project and click on the websites menu button and go into the websites interface, for a given content managed website, if we right click on a content managed web page, so we'll start off with the home page here and click on properties, there is a new setting that appears here called enable web page profiler. So before we can start working out which areas on the web page we want to cache, we first got to work out which areas are slower to load and which ones are faster. So if we click on the yes button and click the save and continue, then in a separate web browser, we will now see this pop-up dialog appear that will show the web page profiler and how long it took for this particular web page to load. So we can see that this web page right now is taking just over 9 seconds to load. And the web page, which is broken down into the different containers, so that's a collection of areas that appear in one part of the page, can live under one container. And then we can see what those areas are for that container and how long each of those areas taking to load. So this particular container, G header image, which is the global header image, is taking 0.38 of a second to load. The container time is 0.6. Now we can go down through this profiler and we can look for areas and containers where that certain areas are taking much longer to load. So here is an example where we have a category tree navigation type area that displays each of the categories here, the top categories as well as the child categories displayed in relevant panels. So this particular area is taking over half a second to load. There's actually 2 areas that display these menus, and correspondingly both those areas are adding up to a second. Now that's quite a lot of time for just 2 areas, and in this case you can see that there are many areas that are set within this page. So these areas that are taking longer to load may be good candidates to start setting up cache. This is what the web page profiler does. It allows you to see all the areas that are being rendered on the page, how much time and effort the backend server has to do in order to render those areas, and not all areas are treated equal. An area that's displaying just simply an image might take only 0.03 of a second to load, whereas an area that displays a lot of information, such as these category navigation areas, take a lot longer to load because the backend has to work out what are all the top categories that the user viewing this web page is allowed to see, and then what are the subcategories underneath that the user is allowed to see as well, to enable all these sub-menus to then be generated out and displayed on the web page. So we may look at these category navigation based areas because when a guest user first meets this page, this content doesn't really need to change between web page requests as they navigate through the website. And as same for a user who's logged in, once they're logged in, the content displays in these menus doesn't typically need to change that often. It may be the case where the category data is only updated once a day on the website. This is a very good candidate to turn caching on because we don't really need to see the absolute most up-to-date category tree every single request. That can be allowed to drift out a little bit, but not too much, because we don't want the data to be too stale, such as if we got rid of this electrical appliances category, we'd want that to disappear sooner rather than later. So with all the benefits that caching provides, there's also the drawbacks that some data is going to be stored in the caches for longer, and it's important to be able to manage that. So let's go back into the back end of our content managed website. Right click on the home page again and click on view all areas. Within the web page editor, we can now see the list of all the areas again and the containers which they belong to. Now we were looking at the 2 areas here under the container called gl_product_menu, and we can now start to turn on caching for these 2 particular areas. If we click on the area options button, we can see a section that here called cache areas that has now allows us to set additional caching options against these areas. By default, caching areas is set to no. That means no caching is going on and requests will be always made to the backend to retrain that area's content. Now the second option says we will want to store instead the area once it has been loaded once on the page for a user to store the content of that area in their session. So that means that we don't need to go to the database, we just need to grab it from the session. But that means every user needs to then cache that area in their own session. And that includes guest users. When a new person navigates to the Content Manager web page, a session is automatically created for them. And then what we can do is put the area's content into that cache. But the moment a user then logs in, a new session is created, and the contents of that area in the cache is now destroyed. And then that area, once it loads again, then will be put back into the cache for the logged in user. Caching areas in the session is very useful for when there's common data that can be reloaded across different web pages. Where it's not good is when the content needs to change on a particular web page. So the header here is a great candidate for storing data for a user in their session. But the consequence of that is that the page has to load at least once in order to be able to generate the content for this area before it can be put in the user session. So that means it's not good for crawlers who consistently navigate to web pages and create new sessions all the time. It is only good for users and guest users who are using session data. So then the other options we have available, rather than storing the area data in a session, we can store it in the database. But as I was saying earlier, we can store it in the database as the final content of that area in its final form. So there are a few different options that we have on how we want that storage to take place. We can have it so that the area's content is stored per user for a given web page. So what that means is that when this web page loads, if we had caching turned on to store the contents of this area for the user and this web page, which is home.html, then when this page was reloaded again, the contents of this area would be retrieved from the database in its final form and loaded in. And for every single different user that loads the home page, the area will be cached separately for each of those users. So that means that if there are 100 users each loading this page, then 100 users would have the area stored in the cache within the database. So that means that there's more caching data stored in the database, but the contents of that cache is unique to every user. Now there is another option that is available here called cache storage time. We can say for how long should that area be retrieved from this cache storage before it tries to regenerate that area and update its contents. So we've got a number of different options here. For these category menus, we may say every 30 minutes, we want to refresh the area in the cache for each user. For the next 30 minutes, once it's stored in the cache, it will be always retrieving that data with minimal workload on the database. And then once it reaches the 30 minutes, it will say that data in the database is out of date, and now we need to regenerate the contents of the area again. If a category was deleted after the user had just cached that area, then the user would have to wait up to 30 minutes before reloading this page and being able to see the category that was either deleted, added, or had its name changed. Getting the timing right of the caching is very important with the kinds of data that are stored in the areas. If the category data is only updated once a week, for example, then we can easily set the storage time to be a lot greater, say once a day or once a week. But if it's being updated every hour on the hour, then we may want to reduce the cache storage time to be a lot shorter. Otherwise, old categories may appear in the category tree, or new categories will not appear in the category tree instantaneously for the users. But the longer that the cache storage time is set for, then the less times when the page is loaded does it have to go back and regenerate all the data for those areas. Ideally, we want to get the timings right to be the maximum amount of time that we can set for the cache without allowing the data to get too stale. So it's important that we set these settings based on how often we're updating the data in the underlying areas. So let's set this for 30 minutes by default. Now when we reload the page, so we can see for this, the category nested navigation area, it's still taking 0.2 of a second to load, which is quite a lot, because this area, when the web page first loaded, it still had to retrieve and calculate the content for that area. Now it can store it in cache. So then when we reload the page for the second time, Now looking at the web page profiler, it's telling us it's now taking 0 seconds in order for that area to load itself. So we've already knocked 0.2 of a second, or 1/5 of a second, off our web page loading times, but just turning caching on for that one particular category area. But the caching is only set for this web page. If a user navigates to a different web page, such as here they're on a category listing page, then the contents of this area then needs to be recached again for this web page. So that's when the other caching options become more desirable to reduce the amount of areas content needs to be cached in each page. So for a category navigation area, a better option for caching is to use this thing called public store global private in session. So what this particular caching option means is that for public or guest users, we want to store the contents of the area in the cache globally. That means for all web pages, regardless of which web page the area is loaded on, we want to store only a single record for that area for guest user. Now for users who are logged in, they're private users, the contents that they can see is only for their eyes only, we instead want to put the contents of that area in their session. So this is a good compromise where we want to use the storage mechanisms for per user to remember the contents of that area. But if they then decide to log in, we're going to put the contents of this, say this category navigation area, in the user session. And that means every time they navigate to all the different category pages, regardless of which page they're on, if this area has been loaded, because it's a global area, it's going to use the cache. So this can dramatically speed up load times across all the possible content managed web pages that the user can navigate to for guest users, as well as for the users who are logged in to use the session caching, which means after they load the page once, this data in the category tree will be cached for the entirety of their session, and then once they log out again, then that will be then deleted. So that means that the category tree won't change for logged in users after the initial page load until they log in again, which typically allows them to have a common experience and not seeing categories magically disappear between sessions. Now, if we look at the other caching options that we have available, we have this other option here called to store the areas cache on a user basis, and also when the page URL changes, but the underlying page itself does not change. This is a good option when we have category listing area like we have here. When we set up content managed websites, we typically only have one page called the category page that shows the different lists of products belonging to different categories. The same page is being used for the clearance stocks category, which is shown here, is also the same page that is generating the computer, keyboard, and mouse category. Now, the URLs are changing, but the underlying web page which is generating this content, it's the same category web page. So the areas on the page dynamically changing their content based on the URL changing. So a good option for these category listing based areas is to either use the store per user and URL. So that means every different category page, we're going to cache its content, which is all these lists of products. If the user navigates to different categories but are loading the same underlying page, then we can ensure that the area's content is going to change because the URL is changing. This is great, but that means it's going to create potentially a lot of cache areas per users, because if we've got 100 category pages and we've got 100 users, then these areas are going to be cached 10,000 times. So a better option for this is that for public users, we want to cache those areas. So we want to cache the category area 100 times for the different categories on the page. But for the private users, we don't want to allow caching for that area. We always want it to dynamically generate the content, and we want to do that because it can specify whether the user has added these products to their favorites or not. Or they will also want to show the quantities that are in the quantity boxes. So it needs to dynamically generate itself more for logged in users than necessarily guest users. So typically good caching options for areas that are stored locally on the page and only exist on the page would be these kind of store-based areas, and areas that appear that are globally. That means that they appear across many different web pages, and that's when either session-based storage should be used or global-based storage should be used. So now I'm going to go through each of the different areas on this home page and turn on area caching for particular areas, and let's see how fast we can get this web page to load. So after reloading the Content Manager web page twice, once to load all the areas that I've set the caching turned on for, and then reloading again, we've now got the web page load time down to 2.3 seconds. So we've gone from 9 seconds down to 2.3 seconds. That's a saving of over 4 times faster for this particular web page to load. And there may be other opportunities to turn on caching on other areas as well to get it even lower. And that will be consistent across guest users who load this web page and create new sessions as well by implementing the database caching storage mechanisms that we talked about earlier. Note that for any area where caching is turned on and using this storage mechanism, that there is the ability to clear all the area content that is previously being cached across all the relevant users by simply clicking on the clear cache storage. Now that works for when the store mechanism is in use, but if the session mechanism is in use, then the user sessions either have to naturally expire or the users have to log out in order to then allow those areas to be cached. So that in that case, it might be better to turn the caching off and then wait 4 to 8 hours for all the sessions to expire, then turn it back on again. So in this particular example for these category navigation based areas, if for example a category needed to be added to the website instantly, then if the storing mechanism was being used, an administrator could click the clear cache storage to flush that out and allow the new categories to appear when those areas are loaded next by the users who are not using session-based caching. Now note that after doing all this caching, if the web page load times are still too long, then this may indicate that we have too many areas that are embedded on the web page, or there may be too many areas that are expensive or take longer to load because the content within those areas is very complicated or requires intensive processing on the servers. So those are other factors to look at after caching has been exhausted. Now once you're finished doing your caching, it is important to go back into the website's Administration Center interface and turn off the web page profiler. Otherwise, all other users who are visiting that page will also see the profiler as well. So you want to keep that setting set to no unless you're actively profiling the web page, and ideally you're only doing that for very short periods of time if it is a production or public facing website that is used by your user base. So this is a great feature to speed up the Content Manager web page load times that have been previously calculated. It is very important to choose the right caching strategy for the different areas to ensure that the area content is not cached for too long, whether that be in the user session or over a given amount of time. Ultimately, this will be beneficial to users because they can navigate throughout the Content Manager websites faster, and it is beneficial for search engines and crawlers who are copying the content of the websites and putting it into their search engines such as Google or Bing. That may also help them rank up the web pages higher within their search features. Click on the video links to view the next features that were added to this release.